Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Urban Education Collaborative's Urban Education Week session, Supporting Black Males in Schools. I'm Sejal Fox, Professor and Chair in the Department of Counseling at UNC Charlotte and serve as the Director of the Urban School Counseling Collaborative, which is a division of the UEC. We are so excited to host our esteemed panelists and to share this space with you today. Today, we will focus on important and current issues related to the unique experiences of Black males in K-12 settings. This session will offer strategies for school counselors and educators to engage in practices that are equity-focused and culturally responsive. Our panelists will share their knowledge and expertise related to strengths-based approaches that support the success of Black male students. We will start with a Q&A and then open up with questions from the audience. Please submit your questions in the chat box and we will get to you and as many questions as we can. With that, I would like to introduce our highly esteemed panelists who are leaders in the school counseling field. Dr. Paul C. Harris is a former high school counselor and is presently an associate professor in education in the Department of Educational Psychology, Counseling, and Special Education at the Pennsylvania State University. He holds affiliate appointments in African American Studies and the Center of Educational Disparities. Dr. Harris's research draws from his previous experiences as a high school counselor and focuses on three areas: investigating the college and career readiness needs of Black youth, analyzing the identity development process of Black male student athletes and the role of school counselors in facilitating the multidimensional sense of self, and examining the process of training school counselors to promote equity and access in K-12 schools. He has over 30 publications and delivered over 70 presentations, and his work has been funded by numerous agencies, including the National Collegiate Athletic Association. In addition to core courses in the school counseling program, Dr. Harris designed undergraduate and graduate courses that focus on counseling all student athletes from a strengths-based perspective, one of those courses centering on Black male student athletes. He currently serves on the editorial review board for the Professional School Counseling Journal and on the senior advisory board for the Professional Counselor Journal. He is also the former president of the Virginia School Counselors Association and former member of the board of directors of the American School Counselors Association. Welcome, Dr. Harris. We are so thrilled to have you. Dr. Erik M. Hines is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Psychology and Learning Systems at the Florida State University, as well as the coordinator of the Counselor Education Program and School Counseling track. Dr. Hines prepares graduate students to be professional school counselors, and his research agenda centers around college and career readiness for Black males, parental involvement and its impact on academic achievement, students of color, and improving and increasing post-secondary opportunities for first-generation low-income and students of color, particularly Black males. Additionally, his research interests include career exploration in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math for students of color, and he has secured research funding to study the college readiness and persistence of Black males to improve their academic and career outcomes. Dr. Hines has worked on several grants aimed at increasing awareness of STEM careers for students of color and rural students. He has over 30 publications and has secured over $1 million in extramural internal funding. His research has appeared in peer-reviewed journals such as the Journal of Counseling and Development, Professional School Counseling, the High School Journal, and Urban Education. Equally important, Dr. Hines is an ACA Fellow and received the Aldi Award for co-editing special issue group work with African Americans, children, and adolescents, which is published in the Journal of Specialists in Group Work. Dr. Hines received his PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park in counselor education with a concentration in urban school counseling. Finally, he has worked as a counselor in various K-12 settings and from the Ronald E. McNair Post-Baccalaureate Achievement Program. Welcome, Dr. Erik Hines. We are both so thrilled to have both of you be a part of our panel today and to learn from you. So with that, I will turn it over to direct some questions to you. And again, for our audience members, if you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them as we can. So the first question, I will start with you, Dr. Hines. Can you share your rationale for editing a special issue on males of color for the Professional School Counseling Journal? Can you talk about some of the gaps you saw in research and in practice that prompted this response?
Yeah, so good afternoon. First, we want to thank Dr. Sajal Fox and Dr. Chance Lewis for the opportunity for creating this space for us to talk about Black males and school counseling and how we can support them. We also want to acknowledge our co-guest editor who isn't here today, Dr. James Moore III, who has been instrumental in his work with Black males on a range of disciplines. And although he couldn't be with us today, he wanted to send his blessings and support for today. So with that being said, with Dr. Moore, Dr. Paul Harris, and myself, we decided that we wanted to do a special issue on males of color in school counseling. That is actually the name of the special issue in the Professional School Counseling Journal. It actually came out in September of 2021, so it's a few months old. We have 19 peer-reviewed articles that span from conceptual to qualitative into quantitative that range the gamut from Latino males, Asian males, and Black males, from some of the best scholars, not only in counselor education, but in the educational field in general. So what we saw was really a lack of literature around males of color and what school counselors can do in their role. And then particularly the centering of the role of the school counselor around being an advocate, a mental health professional, and an educator for males of color. A lot of individuals don't really know about the role of the school counselor. Dr. Harris could probably confirm this as well when we interact with individuals in public or even educators in K-12 school. What do school counselors actually do? What is their role? And so one of the issues that we wanted to emphasize is that, hey, school counselors have the skill set, especially around counseling, collecting data, being able to work on a triage version of mental health counseling, as well as creating interventions that will help support Black males in the school setting, particularly from kindergarten to 12th grade. So that was a huge gap that we saw, in addition to the typical gaps that we talk about now, the opportunity gap, Black males not having the resources to achieve to the level of their white peers, being able to be in well-resourced schools where they have books, where they have teachers who are professionally licensed and getting the best education. And again, seeing those gaps where the school may not necessarily be connected to the community. So with that being said, this is why we wanted to do this special issue, because the school counselor can be the bridge to a lot of these topics in addressing them. And then school counselors also have the skill set to be able to work with various stakeholders, not only from the community setting, but also in the school, in businesses, if we talk about resources, and ultimately with parents. So it took about 2.5 to 3 years to get it off the ground, but nevertheless, this has come out at an important time, given that we talk about racism, the pandemic, the dual pandemic with COVID-19 too. So we thought it was timely in terms of when it came out, and the hope is that this is going to be informative to the school counseling literature.
Certainly, Dr. Hines, and as a practitioner and a counselor educator now, certainly saw the gap in our field with the focus that you have on the special issue. So we really appreciate the fact that it did take 3 years, but it was really well put together. So Dr. Harris, would you like to follow up on that as well? You had such a big part on co-editing this issue, and what did you see in terms of it filling the gap for our profession and other educators?
Yeah, certainly. First, just echoing the gratitude that we have for you, Dr. Fox, Dr. Lewis, Dr. Hancock, and your team for creating this space to have the conversation. And definitely Dr. Moore for his collaborative and partnering nature in this endeavor. One of the things that Dr. Moore and Dr. Hines and I stated in our introduction to this special issue was how the sense of urgency in addressing these concerns really can't be overstated. The racial trauma and discrimination and overall inequities and that have persisted in education for Black males is palpable. And so when we had this initial conversation a few years ago at a conference around what we can do in our sphere of influence, we thought about the utility of a school counselor, particularly through individual counseling, through group counseling, through consultation, family, school, collaborative partnerships, how they could be at the center of delivering comprehensive programs that would serve Black males' needs well, and that there was just sort of a sparseness, if you will, to the literature around the school counselor's role in particular. And so here we are today to discuss more of the school counselor's role in serving this group well.
Thank you. And I appreciate that you focus also on the other stakeholders, that beyond school counselors, we have such an impact that people really don't understand or know about. And so having this space with an urban education collaborative is an interdisciplinary educators group where school counselors are certainly a part of that. And to be able to share to a wider audience, I think it's really important because we know to do this work, the collaboration has to be there. So Dr. Harris, I'm going to stay with you for a little bit and ask, based on your expertise, and you've mentioned this a little bit, is how have the dual pandemics, COVID and racism, further impacted children and adolescents, and particularly Black males?
Yeah, just generally speaking, right? We think about children and adolescents and all that they have to navigate, even without a pandemic. So just emotionally and identity development, socially, there's so much to be navigated, and social interaction we know is key to navigating all of those developmental tasks, right, that they have to negotiate throughout childhood, building autonomy, interdependence, self-regulation, managing emotions, etc. Complicated tasks that we also know systemic racism further complicates for students of color. Then you add in a pandemic that has drastically complicated the process even further. You have prior to schools opening back up, right, there's this further isolation of them, putting them in front of screens for longer periods of time than we desired, which we know is a stressor and exacerbator of mental health challenges, for example, social and physical distancing, limiting contact with families and friends, etc. And so we've seen consequently an uptick in reports of anxiety, suicidal ideation, depression throughout this pandemic and beyond. Add to that fact that youth are also impacted by how the pandemic has impacted their caregivers. So unemployment, financial and emotional stress, fear of infection, highlighting the need now for adults to receive adequate care and support as well. And similarly, healthcare inequities that existed before the pandemic are now just even more so exacerbated. And so now we have kind of, this dual pandemic, these twin disruptions, if you will, of racism and the pandemic only exacerbating what was already sort of an inequitable space in education, right? COVID-19, we know, has disproportionately impacted communities of color, Black communities especially. So we see a higher mental health need and even lower utilization of the services to be accessed. Schools are the places that often provided buffers, particularly for low income and racial minority communities, right? Schools provide supportive social interactions, physical exercise, consistent meals, structured routine, all of those things that support and are the only place many times of support for students. And so again, in this dual pandemic, we've seen those disruptions only exacerbated and disproportionately so, as I mentioned, for the Black communities. The racial marginalization and oppression of people of color has only been felt even more so. And to your earlier point of this interdisciplinary necessity, we see school counselors as a part of bringing those entities together to help improve mental health and educational outcomes, certainly for all students, but Black males in particular.
Yes, absolutely. The sense of urgency just now more than ever with students returning to school, having been left out already, and then they're in their spaces, and still it's widening those gaps. And so, Dr. Hines, again, from your expertise and experiences in your research, what are you seeing in terms of the impacts of those dual pandemics?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Fox. First, I definitely want to acknowledge our American Counseling Association president, who just came in the chat, Dr. Kent Butler, who's also working on this work around anti-racism and eradicating anti-Blackness as well as our president this year. So I wanted to give him a shout out. But one of the things that we are seeing, or several things rather, is that kids are coming back to school with family members, friends, people that they know who have passed away with COVID-19. So they're already coming to school with emotions. Dr. Harris talked about anxiety, depression. Also, kids are missing school. I mean, quarantine, you got 5-10 days at a time. And some of the schools now do not have a virtual option. So they're either taking homework and doing self-work at home by the school, having to be motivated. Parents still have to go to work because they need to make ends meet, to have a shelter and et cetera. And also, I want to mention, even during the pandemic, but even now, there's really been no grace when we talk about discipline, especially with Black children and Black boys. There's still been a kind of a zero tolerance mentality of culture. I remember reading and hearing students, and even from my own personal experiences, that kids are getting suspended in virtual school. How do you get suspended online? As opposed to really trying to understand what is going on in the household while students are still trying to learn and survive and deal with COVID-19. Children are also now talking about the issues of racism and critical race theory. We can talk about current events. There's a heightened sense of awareness from our students about what is going on, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor, and parents are having to have these conversations. And even our students are bringing it to school and asking teachers and asking their counselors about, am I safe? Will my friends be safe? Will my dad be safe? Will my mother be safe? And then if we look at the flip side of that, a lot of the districts, a lot of the states are banning these conversations through what is being called critical race theory, which is another story in and of itself. So teachers and school counselors are not being able to process with students what is going on racially, particularly with Black boys and Black young men. And that has played a huge role in how our students are functioning in the school. And last but not least, I do want to say, and this has been kind of the age-old thing that we talk about, that piece of cultural mismatching. We have teachers who are more so white, suburban, who are teaching us our young men who may not come from suburban affluent areas. And there's a huge disconnect with relationships. There's a huge disconnect with cultural norms. So something that would be developmental for a young boy to do is being penalized by the teacher, and then they're not having the opportunity to be the child that they should be, or doing little adolescent mistakes that come with the process of growing up. So when we talk about these double pandemics and racism, our young Black boys, if I could say that, they have a target on their back. It's a huge target, and it's always guilty before proven innocent. So they're dealing with a lot right now. So you can often imagine, what is it being in their seat? And then if we talk about the parents, particularly mothers, and then also fathers, there's a heightened level of worry there too.
Dr. Hines, that leads into the next question, particularly as we think about internalized messages, that those external experiences and visions and things that we see on TV or news media and those conversations now that children adolescents are having, because they're seeing Black boys, Black men, Black women being killed, out in public. So these things become internalized, and I think oftentimes we say the onus is on the child or the parent to figure out what the solutions are to their problems. But oftentimes, I think as educators, we have to think about our own systems and how we operate within our own systems and what's our responsibility. So can you've highlighted some of these already, but can you talk about some of the unique experiences of Black males in K-12? You talked about discipline that require educators and school counselors to consider how we might approach our work with this population. What are those unique experiences to say what the one size does not fit all, with this specific population?
Correct. So I want to hit on this term we talk about, adultification, adultifying Black boys and young Black men, basically treating them as being older than what they are. So they become these larger than life creatures, beings. They are personifying this non-human existence. So when we talk about adultification, teachers and some of our school counselors too are really looking at our Black boys as adults and treating them as adults, as opposed to not treating them as children. And the actions, again, as I said earlier, are usually developmentally appropriate. So if a kid is lashing out in school, maybe because something is happening at home, we're quick to send them or give them a referral and send them to the office, or we're quick to chastise them as opposed to really asking questions about what is really going on with this young man, what is going on at home, what may be going on in his other classes, or maybe going on in his personal life. Excuse me. And the other piece that I definitely want to talk about too is that a lot of our young boys, they're playing dual roles. So they have a lot of responsibility at home, kind of being an adult, looking after their younger siblings, having to take more responsibilities, or being seen as the man of the house, and then having to come to school and switch the role and being a child, or being treated like a child, and not being understood that, some of the norms at home may not equate to what's going on in the school. I know Dr. Moore, if he was here, what he would often say, and we talk about this all the time, is that educators and particularly school counselors need to adapt to the needs of the child, not having the child adapt to the needs of us. So we need to be studying the neighborhoods that our Black boys are coming from. We need to be engaging with our parents that are the parents of Black boys, and also really understanding that some of our kids are really just being children. They're being boys, they're being girls. So if they're talking back, normally that's developmentally inappropriate. So rather than giving them in-school suspension, how are we talking to them in a way that's saying that's not appropriate? The other piece, you hit on this as well, is that we're looking at the media, how the media portrays children. Now imagine having a son, you sitting there watching the 6 o'clock news, and you see a school safety officer slamming a young Black boy on his stomach and arresting him in high school in front of his friends. Or I'll say something even better. Imagine seeing a 5 or 6-year-old being handcuffed, a black boy or a Black girl. We've seen that on TV, and they are being disciplined by the police officer for something that is probably a little of nothing. So when we talk about trauma, when we talk about socio-emotional issues, imagine how that impacts our students when they see that. Am I being seen as being validated? Can I be seen as human? Or am I going to get the same treatment? So that's why we see a lot of mistrust between educators, law enforcement with our children, because of some of these issues that are being portrayed in the media. And one last thing that I do want to add about the unique experiences of Black males is that we can't assume that because Black men are coming from, or Black boys are coming from very affluent areas. I mean, we have them in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, in areas of Los Angeles, in Houston, in Dallas, New York City, that they don't encounter racism. that money and socioeconomic status will buffer them from racism. If we look at a lot of the data, we still see opportunity gaps. We still see students or Black boys in these areas still experiencing microaggressions. And the thing that we don't understand the most is that in a lot of these schools where they're very affluent and upper class, they may be the only student in their classes. They may be the only student in their school counselor's caseload. So I do want to make sure we emphasize that, and also Black boys who are in private school. I would love to see more school counselors in private schools for Black boys who do go to private schools and who encounter some of those issues. So I think, there's not a one size fits all, but there are a lot of approaches that we need to think about, because our Black boys are in multiple settings when it comes to K-12 schools.
I'm so appreciative that you bring that up in multiple settings, and those issues do not go away because we're in an affluent neighborhood or affluent school, for example. Those concerns still exist. There's a comment in the chat, and Dr. Harris, I'll ask you to respond to this. We have a participant, Larry Thomas, said that it's time to change the narrative. What would you say about steps we can take to change the narrative in schools as we think about being responsive to the needs of Black males in schools?
Yeah, Dr. Hines hit on so many layers of this issue, and because there are so many layers, right? There are so many persisting inequities that disproportionately affect our Black males. We can go to the National Center for Education Statistics if we need to. We can go to whatever Department of Education to see Black males underrepresented in gifted and talented programs, underrepresented in AP classes and honors classes and advanced classes, overrepresented and inappropriately assigned to special education, disproportionately, as Dr. Hines mentioned earlier, affected by discipline. And unless we are willing to say that Black males are inherently deviant, which we are not here on this panel, then we've got to consider how the narrative has been constructed over years and deconstruct and unlearn the practices that perpetuate such victim blaming, that perpetuate the notion that Black males are the problem. And even think about that for a moment. Like, I couldn't help but think about, as we were doing the intro to this issue, we talked about Black males having been considered a problem for so long, unworthy, unintelligent. And it made me think of W.E.B. Du Bois, who years and years ago said, "What must it feel like to be a problem?" This idea, this double consciousness that the Black male lives with, this two-ness. How does that alienation impact one's psyche, one's emotional well-being? Present day, if you have low expectations, you have the disparities that I just mentioned, and feeling blocked out of every avenue to social, political, and economic mobility, it's no question then why we see in practice and in research, Black males in particular feeling like athletics is their only way out. They didn't happen upon that. There's a socialization process that begins very early on that says to them, you need to over-identify with this athletic identity, most often to the detriment of your other identities. You need to feel like that's your only way out, when we all know that is not reality. So how do we shift and change the narrative? I think we deconstruct all of the layers of the way systemic racism pervades education. At a micro level, I mentioned expectations, certainly at a policy level, who decides and how is it decided who gets into gifted and talented? What are the barriers and gatekeeping mechanisms that decides who can or cannot get into an honors or an AP classes? Who gets to sit in on those meetings where they find out about their scholarships, to the particular schools? Like, how is it determined who gets into these particular paths? And so, though tracking may not appear as explicitly as it used to, we all know that it very much still exists, whether it's programs that predicate AP recommendations on PSAT or SAT scores, which we know are incredibly biased, or other mechanisms in education that may more subtly but no less impactfully harm Black males of color. And so again, we know Black males aren't benefiting from the educational system in the ways that their counterparts are. And so it's kind of pastime, if you will, to recognize a sense of urgency. So in terms of changing that narrative, it's absolutely important to not say you are the problem, you're underachieving, right? But rather say, how are we not creating opportunities? Where's the gap in our creating access to the opportunities that, if we're available to all of you, you'd take advantage of and thrive and maximize your potential? And I think that's a narrative as educators more broadly that we can certainly shift and embrace, such that there's a system now curated for the success of Black males, and they don't feel disassociated or alienated or otherwise disconnected from the curriculum. Who do we have that we're reading in the classrooms? All of those practical things that speak to supporting Black males. How do we decolonize? And I'll end with this and put a pin in it. Even epistemology, our ways of knowing and what has shaped the norm that we compare everything to. Many times, it's alienating for Black males to sit in those spaces and feel othered by curricula that describe a way of knowing that is not congruent with who they are, nor who their ancestors have been. And so I think just upending and thinking through all of how we structure and deliver education helps to change the narrative and puts them in a position to actually thrive and be who we know they can be.
And I certainly appreciate the fact that you say you have to put a pin in it. And I'm like, no, we all need to hear this. And we need to have these conversations because we're not having them enough. And we can't deconstruct these narratives until we, I think, continue to have these conversations. And it leads into the next question, actually, that you mentioned, Dr. Harris, about the pathways, right? It's the identities we impose that you talked about on Black males, that going into athletics is pretty much the only way you're going to get to go to college, for example. And so we know that Black males are being left out of academic and post-secondary opportunity. You spoke to this a little bit. You know, I have my ideas about why I think that is, but based on your research, and you and both Dr. Hines do research in this area, what are some of the reasons that you found that exists, and how can we challenge ourselves to be more accountable to remove these barriers?
Yeah, I think we've outlined a lot of sort of the reasons that we might see such challenges and barriers, micro level, macro level. So I think I'll speak a little bit to how we can challenge ourselves to be accountable, and because I probably did go over a little bit on that last, I'll give some space for Dr. Hines to also speak to all of it that he wants to speak to. But I think of the metrics that guide our work. And so I think one of the ways that we can challenge ourselves to be more accountable, to remove those barriers, is to name them in the very metrics and the very outcomes that we seek. If we look more broadly at some of the data points like achievement or attendance or, sort of behavior outcomes, many times we don't see them disaggregated and named, right? So we might have a school, as I've worked in them, that have said, we're accredited. Our schools we have, or our school has this percentage of kids going on to college, but we don't look at sort of the disaggregated nature of that data that would show Black males of color, Black males and other students of color who are not applying, who have high aspirations, but those aspirations we know from research, Laura Perner and others, McDonough, and those who kind of do work around college choice process, we know that it doesn't match their college attendance rate. And so I think taking some of the broader metrics and actually drilling down a bit more to say, but what actually is happening with our Black males in this case? Or if we wanted to go into other spaces, our ELL students, our Latinx students, what's happening with those most vulnerable? And let's name metrics and evaluate our success by that.
Name metrics and evaluate our success. That's a big takeaway, I think, that we can all, could leave this meeting and name metrics and be accountable to those. So Dr. Hines, what would you like to add to that?
One of the barriers that we see with Black males is that we often celebrate them on the field and we celebrate them in entertainment, but we don't celebrate them in the classroom. We don't celebrate them in the laboratory. We don't celebrate Black men in the boardroom. So how are we creating exposure to these opportunities so that Black males can see themselves in these spaces? We don't talk about individuals like Garrett Morgan, who was a Black man who created the traffic light. He also created what is now known as the modern gas mask. How do we continue to have these conversations? And going back to what we said previously, changing that narrative. How do we ensure that Black males have the support they need rather, if they want to go into STEM careers or STEM majors? How are we giving them that extra support in the classroom to make sure that they know what it takes to be an engineer or engineering major in college, that they know what it takes to be a mathematician in college, and understanding the concepts around that career? The other way to remove barriers is simply by bringing Black males who are in post-secondary settings or who have graduated from post-secondary settings into the schools. One of our authors for our special issue, Dr. Appling, Brandy Appling, and Dr. Chanel Robinson, they talked about bringing Black males to their classroom in their school counseling courses and really having those conversations with their school counselors about what is it that they need to know in order to work with Black boys. And I will go even further. What school counselors need to do to be able to remove the barriers for post-secondary pathways is having them understand what affinity groups are available at the different institutions that our Black men are applying to. I was a director for a living learning community for Black males at one of my previous institutions. And we would bring middle school students, Black males, we would bring high school students in, and they would actually get to talk to freshmen and sophomore Black men about their experiences in college. But the unique thing about that was they were able to talk about, well, if I was back in high school or even in middle school, this is what I would have done. I would have asked more questions. I would have made sure my teacher gave me all the resources that I needed to do well in this particular calculus course, which would help me now in my engineering course. The other piece is that one of our other authors, Dr. Derek Brooms, he wrote an article in our special issue with 20 Black males at a same-sex school. They talked about their interactions with the school counselor and what we need to do to remove barriers for Black men in post-secondary pathways is develop what he put in his paper, The Framework of Relational Trust. Are we having positive regard for Black men or Black boys? Do we respect where they're coming from or their paradigms? And also, are we really invested in Black men? This has to be an investment issue. The investment comes to, are we going above and beyond to help them in their college applications? Are we making sure that the parents understand the financial aid process and what goes into it? Do we also help them understand what type of college that they're going to? This college may be better for engineering, or this college may be better for literature and for film. So really being an intrusive school counselor, getting all in their business, as I like to say, I used to do that a lot with my guys, and being able to show them, hey, I'm really trusting that you will have a successful life, and my investment in you is going to be an investment in humanity. So, and then the last piece I want to mention too, when we talk about eliminating barriers, is talk about HBCUs, the historical richness of historically Black colleges and universities. We don't often talk about that. These were the only institutions before integration that our students were going to. And that HBCUs are one of the top producers of Black men and Black women in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. A lot of institutions are really producing the next generation of STEM folks. So I think we need to emphasize that to our Black boys and know that, hey, there's more to life than going to a research one or a flagship institution. There are a multitude of institutions that will get you to your career goal, and that it's okay not to have a 4.0. You may have a 3.0, you may have a 2.8. And as Mama used to tell me, it's not where you start, it's where you finish. So we have to look at our Black males as being successful right now and even down the road. We're having expectations that you're going to do well. You're going to be better than where you are today. So I think those are the key areas for me in terms of removing those barriers for post-secondary to get them into post-secondary pathways.
Thank you. We had a question in the chat, and you attended to that about promoting HBCUs and valuing them as much as we do other PWIs and Research One institutions. And so those are certainly the pipelines that we know have been created, but you said a historical perspective of why those institutions exist in the first place is really important for folks to understand. I want to switch gears a little bit. We only have an hour and there's so much we can talk about, but I do want to switch gears a little bit. We are school counselors after all, and there is an important aspect to our role in supporting the social, emotional, mental health of all of our students. And so I'm going to read a comment from Dr. Hancock from the chat, and said, trauma-informed curriculum has become a reality in urban schools. How can teachers support the trauma of students when, one, the school may be the source of the trauma, two, teachers lack cultural competence to create it related to the creation of trauma, and the teachers lack of skills. So we're looking at, they might be the source, the lack of cultural competence, and their lack of skills and training. What are your thoughts about that, and how we're shifting the gears from school counselors but to teachers, but I think it's relative to all educators in the building. So let's start with Dr. Hines, and then please, Dr. Harris, if you want to definitely add to this question.
One way is that school counselors are trained in these areas. So we're at Florida State University, in my program, we're always training our pre-service school counselors to work with teachers to gain these skills to use in the classroom. It easily can come in the form of a professional development at a faculty or school personnel meeting. The other piece of creating a cultural competence or cultural responsiveness for teachers is that school counselors, by mandate, if they're in an accredited, KCREP accredited program, they must take a culturally responsive course. And here we talk about cultural responsiveness throughout our program. So that is another space where school counselors can really talk with teachers about being culturally responsive. And school counselors also have the skills to even have these personal conversations with teachers around observations. Well, I think you could do this a little differently in the classroom, or I think you could talk to Johnny in a way that is more affirming and more asset-based. So it really comes to being able to have the conversations, but also have the training. But of course, making sure that there is buy-in from the principal and assistant principal. There really has to be a team approach to cultural responsiveness, and making sure that leadership emphasizes this, and not only emphasizes this, consistently talk about it, and also being able to enforce it. The other piece that I want to talk about around culture is we could do small things such as setting up murals around schools that promote diversity, that promote inclusion, that talk about famous folks that may have come from their schools, or folks who are doing well. And so those are, I think, some of the keys to being able to shore up some of the trauma-informed for me, and the cultural responsiveness, because I think that's going to be key. If Black boys don't feel welcomed in the school and they're already dealing with issues, you're not going to get buy-in at all. You're not going to get any type of engagement. In fact, a lot of the mistrust issues are going to play out as defiancy or defiant issues, and school counselors are able to be to translate that for teachers so that they can understand what is actually happening in the classroom when it comes to behaviors.
Dr. Hines, you hit on a few things, one of which I want to echo in my comments. I think about leadership. Even my present space, the Dean of the School of Education at Penn State, where I'm currently an associate professor, Kimberly Lawless has an anti-racist strategic plan and agenda, and that work is incentivized. And I think at a K-12 level, the leadership can be quite influential in how they cast vision for what will be supported and encouraged and celebrated, and what will not be accepted, if you will. And not that there will just be punitive action, there can be certainly restorative, practices that help teachers and other educators along, but it will be clear that that is not the direction that we're going in. So I just wanted to start there in terms of the importance of leadership. In terms of some specific approaches, I think there are several that warrant our attention. You know, I think of Dr. Ahmad Washington out of University of Louisville. He wrote a piece in this special issue on critical hip hop school counseling. And it's a framework that's designed to really promote the critical consciousness of Black males, helping them to understand the anti-Black discourse and practices in schools that literally endanger Black life. And I think that very framework and the steps that he encourages in his piece that we can take can be applicable to practitioners as well. Because in understanding those discourses, those practices, we can then unlearn the ways that such trauma is inflicted at our hands as educators. There's also Dr. Griffin and her colleagues. They wrote a piece in this special issue that speak to family community partnerships through an anti-racist lens, right? And so looking at how our practices as individual educators, but even more broadly, the school expect for parents and other community members to sort of engage us on our terms versus leveraging and building on the assets in said community to strengthen and maximize the potential of our students. And I think in doing that, we can also add to the cultural competence, as Dr. Hancock alluded to, many educators may be lacking in, but also supporting even the trauma of students that they experience outside of the schools by connecting with the spaces from which they come and the strengths that exist in those spaces to help them to navigate, navigate them well. Dr. Vernon Smith, another author, talks about, and Dr. Hines has published on this as well, just further the role that parents can play. I think oftentimes we see parents of our Black youth especially as not being interested or caring, when in fact there's a lot of care and there's a lot of work and effort on their part to support their children, but the ways, again, that we have parents engage aren't necessarily congruent. And so kind of meeting them where they are in such a way that those strengths can be maximized. I think all of that helps to get to, certainly not in a comprehensive or any sort of panacea cure-all way, but in some ways gets at the trauma that our students endure in ways that we can support them and not exacerbate it.
Yes, and as I'm listening to you, Dr. Harris, number one, you had an all-star lineup in your special issue as you're naming all of our authors. And also, I will say to the audience here and those who may be listening in the future is go check out the special issue. You know, that is something that you can utilize immediately. And if you're not a school counselor, if you're an educator, if you're a school leader, go check out that special issue of professional school counseling, because those are the comprehensive areas that you've all tied together in that one issue. So the next question I'm going to pose here, and it'll, I think, help close our time, but it's the work that we need to do as those in a position of power and privilege. And so I think the question that often at times that I ask myself and ask students is, how do we continue to challenge our own assumptions, our own biases, our own racist attitudes that we might carry, that we sometimes, you know, we don't want to bring those to fruition. It's difficult work in doing that. And so what would you say in terms of how we as educators, school counselors can work it from our position of privilege, and then work from a place for empowerment and a strengths-based approach and not deficit-based? You know, we're not going to save individuals. We're trying to draw out strengths, as you mentioned, and empower individuals and communities and Black males in particular in this case. So what is the work that we need to do, and how might we go about that from your perspectives?
Doctor, you know, I would say firstly, and I see our time, I know we want to leave a little bit for questions too, so I'll be as brief as I can. There's an activity I do with my students. I think this will capture it, some of my sentiments well. And I ask them, what's in your world? And I literally ask them to draw what's in their world. And they do pictorially represent what's in their world that day. I give them a little bit of time to do it. And then we talk about it. And so from a strengths-based perspective, we speak to all of the influences, experiences, people, upbringing, all of that has shaped our view of the world and the many strengths that exist within our world. It does a number of things we don't have time for here to discuss, one of which it elevates some of those things they may not see as strengths, right? And it helps them to feel like their voice is in fact unique and needed in this world. But it also highlights blind spots. No matter whose world it is, mine, yours, all of ours, there are blind spots. The Johari window, if we were to Google that, we could see the box there that speaks to the things that others may see in us, but we don't. We all have those blind spots. And unless we are in community that is not always like us, doesn't always think like us or look like us or sound like us, we will forever have those blind spots. But I think that's one piece of being in community where there can be a flashlight, if you will, kind of shown upon our blind spots, not for indictment or condemnation, but for building up so that we can serve an even broader array of students better, right? I would say to add to that, critical consciousness, and we've kind of spoken to that, but being more aware of oppression in society and all of the socio-political implications that follow, that has to be intentional. That has to be, they say leaders are readers. That has to be picking up textbooks that maybe not on our shelves yet, but need to be, so we can learn a little bit more about history and how we might be repeating history unintentionally. I think we also need to think about how kind of the ways that I think of Jamar Tisby, and this will capture, and then I will put a pin in it here. Historian Jamar Tisby says it this way. He says, racism doesn't go away, it just adapts. And so I think if we are constantly doing the work of deconstructing, we've used that word a lot, but unlearning the practices, even amongst well-intentioned people that perpetuate these decades-long inequities, and be intentional and active about that, and understanding the ways that it happens. I think those are things that we can all actively do and honestly never stop doing, throughout our careers. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Dr. Hines?
Yeah, so I'll start with something that is very simple and straightforward. And most of us school counselors, this is the first thing that was taught to us in our training programs. Listening to Black boys, listening to the stories, listening to the experiences, and validating them, Black boys and men, and how we can best support them. And also actually implementing the advice that they give us and having them as allies and co-conspirators in changing practice and policy. The other piece that we could do, again, is going back to reframing that narrative. I know Dr. Janice Bird, Dr. Joseph Williams, and Dr. Ahmad Washington with Christina Lloyd, they talk about bibliotherapy, and they use books with young men to talk about breaking down barriers, really having students see themselves, or Black boys, see themselves from an asset-based perspective. The other piece that we have to continually tell each other and say, and tell our Black boys, is that they are smart, they are brilliant, they are genius. Black boys matter. We have to continue to tell them Black boys do matter. So if we want to empower our young men, this is what we have to say. And then continually saying that to our parents. How many times do we call home for something that is positive for our young Black boys, as opposed to something negative? Picking up the phone, Miss Johnson, I just want to say your son is a leader. He is doing great in the class. He is taking initiative. How empowering is that for parents to hear that their young men are doing well in the school, but not only doing well, that again, the school has a vested interest in their well-being. So when we talk about asset-based paradigms, this is where we need to start at for school counselors. And this is how our Black boys can feel that they have the tools that they need to be successful, because they have educators and school counselors behind them 100%.
Yes, definitely communicating those messages that you do matter, and you are smart, and you are talented, and you do belong here. So this there's a comment in the chat that actually leads to our final question, and it is about having there's a research gap with counselors having enough knowledge, training, and coaching to provide the things that you've mentioned by our counselors, and many of them who do not have the experience, knowledge, and comfortability to lead this charge. It is significantly affecting our students' K-12 and post-secondary trajectory. So that does lead to our one of our questions here is, how can counselor educators train pre-service school counselors to work with Black males? And Dr. Hines, I'll start with you.
So over the past year, there have been plenty of webinars and trainings around cultural responsiveness, being able to provide leadership when we talk about anti-racism and anti-Blackness. I think one of the things we have to deal with is, Dr. Fred Bremak talks about this all the time, the nice counselor syndrome. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily, from what I've been seeing, even in training and with school counselors, that they may not lack the knowledge, maybe the experience, but they want to be liked. They want folks to be on their team. They don't want to be the outlier, but it takes leadership, and it also takes going against the grain to be able to have these conversations with teachers and with administrators. And I would say this, professionally calling them out on issues that may negatively impact Black boys. So I know one of the things that I do, and Dr. Harris does as well, is that we work with counselors who are in service. We also talk with our counselors who are training our pre-service school counselors on the knowledge that they need in order to be advocates for Black males. So the leadership is going to have to come from advocacy, and that nice counselor syndrome has to be the way of the past, because we do more than just be nice. We have to be able to use data. And that's one thing that I wanted to say earlier, is that a way to get into the schools and have these conversations. So we know principals and assistant principals understand data. They understand numbers and percentages. So if we're using the data on Black boys to talk about these gaps and to be able to provide interventions, this is an entryway in order for school counselors to do their job and do it effectively, because you can't deny the data. As Jay-Z would often say, numbers don't lie. So that's one way that we need to be able to talk with our school counselors and making sure that they have those current ways of approaching this work and feeling comfortable about it.
Dr. Harris?
Ditto to all of it. When I think about training pre-service school counselors, I think about the multicultural counseling course that was appropriately placed in the curriculum many years ago, and how that today is not, it never has really, but it's not sufficient to be the only space within which we have these conversations. There has to be an anti-racist lens infused throughout the curricula, including practicum and internship. There ought to be assignments, very intentional opportunities and experiences that are measured and assessed, that allow students to engage in conversation and practice around issues of equity, access, and social justice. I think, when I think about, and we can even back up a step and zoom out and talk about admissions practices. How are we, even as gatekeepers, making it, I'll ask it this way, for whom are we making it more difficult to access this profession? So when we talk about pipelines, and Dr. Hines mentioned earlier how our education force in general tends to be predominantly white and female, in what ways at the graduate school level are we structuring admissions practices? Are we elevating the GRE, for example, when we know of its biases towards certain groups? How can we even think even more broadly about who's coming to us to have these conversations to then serve students? All of that, all of those pieces, I think, kind of contribute to ways that we can then train pre-service school counselors to serve Black males of color more effectively. And certainly that last sort of leg of that in research, we talked a lot about deconstructing narratives and such. I think the research on just how to do that well has to continue. How do we understand the way racism and anti-Black discourse plays out in school? That kind of research also needs to continue so that we can continue to employ evidence-based practices in our work in K-12 schools.
Yes, absolutely. That the work to start with us and our admissions practices and at the graduate school level and trickles all the way down into the school buildings. Our time is up here right at 1 o'clock. I just want to say thank you so much for being with us today. We know you're so busy. We've had folks request your contact information, and thank you graciously put that in the chat. So you might get a lot of contacts right after this. We really appreciate your time. And I also want to thank Dr. Moore. I know he couldn't be here today, but also to be contributing to the special issue, and all of the authors who contributed to the special issue that you published. Also want to thank all of the attendees that took the time out to be here. The recording will be available. So if you can, be patient with us, we will get it posted, and, share it with your classes, share it, whether you're an educator, school leader, a school counselor, share it with wider audiences as well. With that, any final comments from Dr. Hines or Dr. Harris?
Go ahead. Just thank you to everyone on the call and to everyone who is doing this work and wanting to do it better. Just a note of gratitude, because we are all, as you referenced earlier, Dr. Fox, in community serving together. And so I, for one, am just grateful to be a small part of the larger village that's wanting to see Black males thrive. And so thank you for doing the work. Be encouraged in doing the work, and know that your work is, in fact, making a difference. Thank you.
I just want to reiterate, thank you, Dr. Fox. Thank you, Dr. Hancock, and thank you to the audience for engaging us. And if I had to end it, Black boys and Black men matter.
Indeed, they do. And just want to say thank you to Dr. Chance Lewis and the Urban Education Collaborative and Dr. Stephen Hancock for being leaders in this work on the education side. We appreciate you giving us space as school counselors to have this conversation. I wish all of you well, stay well, be in community, and thank you so much. With gratitude, I'm just going to go have a great day today. Thank you so much. You all take care.